Now to a particularly sad story. According to the Oregon Health Authority, 522 people died homeless in Oregon in 2022. Now, when someone dies that way, it can be challenging to learn much about them. They've sort of dropped off the grid. And that is what happened to a man who died in Bend this last January. But he did have a history, and he did have a story. In fact, he'd been the mayor of Bend. Before his death, Bend Bulletin reporter Bryce Dole met him at an emergency shelter.
Right around Christmas, I was reporting in a shelter about people who were taking shelter from the conditions. And I just bumped into this guy and he said, hey, I was actually the mayor. And he had been living in that shelter for a few months at that point.
The man he ran into was named Craig Coyner III. He was indeed the mayor of Bend in 1984. He served on the city council for more than a decade. Bryce Dole's article about him is worth your time. Dole talked to Coyner's family and friends to find out how a man who was once so connected, so powerful, ended up dying homeless. Coyner was a Marine Corps vet who served stateside during the Vietnam War. He grew up in Bend. He came from a prominent family in Central Oregon.
Craig Coyner III was a city councilor here in Bend for about 12 years. He was also the mayor for a year. He was a defense attorney and a prosecutor for decades. He's somebody who was heavily involved in this community. The Coyner family is fairly well known in Deschutes County. They were pretty involved in the development and ownership of a lot of the buildings around town. There still are, there's two avenues in Redmond that are named after them called Coyner Avenue. There's a point, kind of a prominent place near downtown Bend that was known as Coyner Point for a very long time. And there's also a trail that's still here called Coyner Trail. So basically, if you're a longtime local in Bend, you likely know, or a lot of folks do know, the Coyner family.
And throughout his life, the one-time mayor struggled with mental illness. It came to a head about 2 decades ago. He'd been a lawyer, but he lost his license after a series of ethics violations. And then his wife died in 2008. And later, he lost his home.
Kind of in the mid-2000s, Craig had stated publicly after he'd been disciplined by the Oregon Supreme Court that he had been struggling with mental illness, including he'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and he had been self-medicating with alcohol. He struggled with substance abuse a lot throughout his life, and this is according to his family members, his friends, his colleagues, all of whom I interviewed for this story, as well as his daughter. So he proceeded to, he had his license suspended by the Oregon State Bar. He never had it reinstated. And then he, around the housing market crash, was trying to fight for other people who were losing their homes at that time. And at that exact same time, he was actually struggling to pay his own bills. And over the next, about the next, a little bit less than a decade, he fought a mortgage company trying to keep that home. And he ultimately, he lost. So it was kind of the culmination of several different struggles that he'd been experiencing for a lot of his life. And while he was experiencing homelessness at the end of his life, a lot of his family members, they didn't really know where he was. He'd kind of drifted out of their lives.
In January, Coyner was taken to the hospital. He had frostbite, he had a toe amputated, and then he died of a stroke while he was going through severe alcohol withdrawal. His family says they had tried to find him over the years, as you heard there, but they didn't have a lot of success. Regardless, they think his story does deserve to be told.
They really believe that he deserves to be remembered. He was an extremely flawed man. He was very, very complicated. He was arrested many times. He was disciplined by the bar many times. He drifted or pushed away the people who loved him, including his children. And he did live, according to his sister, with regret because of some of the mistakes that he'd made most notably that he wasn't really in his children's life. But at the same time, at least one of his daughters, had some time at the end of his life to be there with him and to try and kind of understand him.
Dole says he's gotten a lot of feedback from the story. You can understand that. It comes from people who understand the same struggle of losing a family member or a friend this way.
A lot of people who read this story reached out to me saying that it was very similar to what happened to their loved one, whether their loved one experiences mental illness, struggles with substance abuse, experiences homelessness. It was relatable to people, but I think the big overarching theme that I heard from a lot of people was that this story shows that something like this can happen to anybody. A lot of people look at people experiencing homelessness and think that it's just, their decision, and that the person screwed up somehow, and that it's just and while I think Mr. Coyner did make a lot of mistakes in his life, I think a lot of tragedy also happened to him. And I mean, his life was the result of many tragic circumstances as well.
You can read the entire piece now in the Bend Bulletin. We have a link to it on our social media. You may need to disable your ad blocker. I discovered that. And tonight at the City Council meeting in Bend, the current mayor, Melanie Keblar, is making a statement in remembrance of the former mayor.